Exactly 100 years ago, the gifted young Austrian painter Gustav Klimt completed the portrait of a young Jewish woman who lived here with her family in this impressive house on Elisabethstrasse in the heart of Vienna. Just across the street is the Vienna Academy of Art, famous for having thwarted the ambition of another aspiring artist, Adolf Hitler, to whom they refused entry. The portrait of Adele, Klimt's masterpiece, would remain in Elisabethstrasse and in the family, along with 4 other Klimt paintings for the next 30 years, until one disastrous night in 1938. The fate of those paintings and of the family is the subject of tonight's Imagine. It's a remarkable story.
The paintings were taken out of my uncle's house, stolen with all the rest of the goods. In 1938, the trucks came and loaded everything.
The Holocaust was not only one of the greatest murders in history, it was also one of the greatest thefts in history.
How do I feel about going to court, having to sue for something that is actually ours? I'm not a fighter, I don't enjoy it.
Either we are right or Maria Altmann is right, but no way in between.
The woman in the golden portrait, Adele Bloch Bauer, was Maria Altmann's aunt. Maria's fight to recover the golden portrait and 4 other paintings by the artist Gustav Klimt turned out to be a Pandora's box, forcing all sides to confront painful memories about Austria's past and uncomfortable truths about the legitimacy of its cultural legacy.
I was born in Vienna in February 1916. My mother saw to it that I was raised in a very simple way. I wore the ugliest dresses in my class, and I was totally unspoiled. I had enough pocket money for chestnuts in winter and Italian ice cream in summer.
Maria's mother, Therese Bauer, was the sister of Adele, the woman in the golden portrait. The Bauer sisters married 2 brothers, Ferdinand Bloch, a sugar magnate, and Gustav Bloch, a Viennese lawyer. They were known as the Bloch Bauer family. Adele and Ferdinand were childless. Therese and Gustav had 5 children. The youngest was Maria.
The thing I never realized was that I was born and raised in a very upper-class family. Every Friday there was chamber music at my parents' house. My father played the cello, and not that he was a fabulous cellist, but Rothschilds had loaned him for life their Stradivarius. And we called it the 6th child because my father was terrified that anything could happen, and when we left for the summer, it was placed in a safe.
The Bloch Bauer family were prominent figures in Vienna's thriving Jewish community, a civilized and sophisticated elite, cultural patrons who enabled the arts to flourish at the beginning of the 20th century.
For them, religion was not the main issue. They would invite artists and journalists and politicians and scientists to discuss matters in an informal way.
Adele was a woman of today that lived in a world of yesterday. If she would live today, she would have gone to the university, she would have had a career, she would have wanted to work. And that wasn't done in those days. She wanted to get out and be in a world that she could create for herself.
Both Ferdinand and Adele Bloch Bauer were great patrons of the arts. Ferdinand had a greater appreciation of old masters and older Austrian art, 19th century Austrian art. Adele appreciated the modern, the contemporary art more and had close relationships with a number of artists. Oskar Kokoschka, who did a portrait of Ferdinand, and Gustav Klimt, probably the most notable of the artists whom they supported.
Those who went out of their way to buy Klimt were also embarking on a kind of adventure, a kind of cultural adventure. They were willing to take the risk of buying an artist who was making something new, who was making a new statement, who was part of a new movement. It was the moment of, Freud and Schoenberg and Karl Kraus and Schnitzler and Klimt.
And Hitler. The young Austrian-born artist Adolf Hitler had come to Vienna with dreams of becoming a great painter. He spent 9 unsuccessful years trying to earn his living as an artist, but time and again he was rejected by Vienna's prestigious Academy of Art. Meanwhile, Gustav Klimt had established himself as one of the most prominent members of the Vienna school of Art Nouveau. His primary subject was the female body, and his work celebrated a new eroticism, inspired by Freud's ideas on female sexuality. Adele was one of his favorite subjects.
She first began to sit for him in 1900, and the portrait wasn't completed till 1907. So obviously during this time, he made hundreds of sketches. During this time, they probably became very close, and he probably meant a lot to her. Klimt must have been a whole new experience for her. An artist, a man from a completely different class, a man who obviously also had intellectual interests. We know that he read Goethe, and then he apparently carried a copy of the Divine Comedy in his pocket. The fact that he socialized with so many of his patrons suggests that he had a lot to offer intellectually and socially.
When I asked my mother, was Aunt Adele a lover of Klimt? She said, "How dare you say such a thing? It was an intellectual friendship." Well, it may have been, but I don't know. I'm sure people at the time did the same thing they do now, but they didn't talk about it. I always thought she was a cold person, but I'm sure Klimt didn't think so.
Klimt's portrait of Adele Bloch Bauer first went on public display in 1907. Adorned in jewels and gold, she resembles an ancient Egyptian queen. The golden portrait is a glittering fragment of a cruel century whose madness Klimt foresaw. 30 years later, this necklace would be a wedding gift for Maria from her uncle Ferdinand. In 1912, Ferdinand commissioned a second portrait of his wife.
Adele drafted a will in January 1923, while she was still a young woman. She made Ferdinand her universal heir, and she asked that after his death, that he donate the pictures to the Austrian National Gallery.
In 1925, 2 years after writing her will, Adele died of meningitis. She was 43 years old. Her ashes were placed in the family vault in Vienna's central cemetery. And Ferdinand turned Adele's bedroom in the Elisabethstrasse house into a memorial to his wife.
There was nothing in the room except beautiful flowers and the Klimts. We were always there on Sundays and holidays. I knew those Klimts so well.
Maria was just 9 when her aunt Adele died. She grew up in an urbane family that felt more Austrian than Jewish. At 21, Maria married Fritz Altmann, a young, aspiring opera singer. A world of promise seemed to stretch before them. The Germans absorbed Austria into the Third Reich in what was called the Anschluss.
The Austrians tried to say later that they were victims. There were no victims. They were totally happy, cheering. The church bells were ringing. The women threw flowers at the soldiers. And there was tremendous jubilation in the streets. Everything changed. There was still the last chamber music at my father's house the night the Nazis marched in. And that chamber music ended the beautiful life for Jewish people in Vienna.
Ferdinand Bloch Bauer moved to his castle near Prague in Czechoslovakia 3 days after the Nazis marched into Austria. In Vienna, Austrian Nazis unleashed a reign of terror and a frenzy of pillage and looting against the city's Jews.
There were so-called wild Aryanization. Wild Aryanization is a spontaneous act where someone is dispossessed, if you will, going into a Jewish proprietor's shop, literally grabbing him by the shirt or by the coat and throwing him out the door and taking control of his business, taking over Jewish apartments.
My father went to the park with my mother in late March, early April, after the Nazis came. And in the meantime, the Gestapo came to the house and asked for the cello because they found it in the Rothschild possessions. And my father's butler gave it to them. And just like the thread of life was cut through, he died a few months later. The love of life, the strength for life was gone, and for a lot of people. They came to our house, and after a few questions, they asked me for my jewelry, because I had gotten such gorgeous jewelry because my wedding was just 6 weeks before. And I was terrified that they would arrest my husband, Fritz, so I said, I have more at the jeweler. So after everything was brought in, including the diamond necklace of the famous gold portrait, they just took it and put it in a bag. Nothing was written down, nothing. They just poured it in a little bag. And then they arrested my husband a few days later. At first, my husband was in the prison in Vienna, And then one day I came and brought him his fresh laundry, and I was told he isn't there. I went crazy. I had no idea where he was. So I sent wires to everywhere. And I did send a wire to Dachau. And I have this wire which says, Altmann in camp, in good health, signed the commander of the camp.
With Maria Altmann's husband Fritz in Dachau concentration camp, Austrian Nazis seized his brother Bernhard's cashmere factory, one of the most successful in Europe.
The people that had taken over the factory went to see my brother-in-law in Paris and said, if you want to see your brother again, make your customers send their checks to us for the goods instead of to you to Paris. And my brother-in-law signed it, and they released Fritz the next day. So Fritz came home, the head was shaven, he looked awful and gone. It was horrible.
Maria and Fritz Altmann, like thousands of other Jews, were now desperately seeking exit visas or other means of escape from Austria.
We made 3 attempts to escape. One was a false passport that didn't work, and the other one was somebody was supposed to come and pick us up, and he got scared in the last minute.
Fritz asked his brother Bernhard to help them escape. Miraculously, they managed to reach the Dutch border, but were only saved by divine intervention in the shape of a young priest.
There was these few minutes when there was no one at the border police, and he took us over, and then there was a barbed wire, and we had to climb over it, and for years I kept the stockings that were torn on the barbed wire. And then the next day, the Gestapo came to my mother and said, we know where your children are, but we can get them back. And so my mother said, I'm sorry, but you are wrong. My daughter just called me from England.
Meanwhile, Maria's uncle, Ferdinand Bloch Bauer, was still hiding in Prague.
He was accused of evading taxes, of having hidden income in previous years, and a fine was levied against him. This was a completely false, bogus crime that was justification, was aimed at the expropriation of his property.
The Nazis seized Ferdinand Bloch Bauer's sugar factory, his house on Elisabethstrasse, his collection of porcelain and art.
They were taken. We didn't know where they were taken, but they were gone. Friends of my parents had committed suicide because they didn't know where to go. Our pediatrician took morphine, and friends of my mother, she committed suicide, she with her son, because for people who had no money, no knowledge of language, there was a dark curtain, and behind that curtain was nothing. So what could they do?
In March 1939, the Nazis invaded Czechoslovakia. Ferdinand Bloch Bauer escaped to Switzerland.
One of the paradoxes of the Nazi regime was that the leaders, the most barbarous, malevolent individuals in history, thought themselves men of culture and were passionate art collectors. Adolf Hitler collected more art in a short amount of time than any individual in history. At war's end, he had over 5,000 old master paintings, a massive collection. The Nazis let loose the plundering commandos and started to seize these works, both personally and for the museums of which they were so proud.
There was a tremendous interest in the Bloch Bauer collection. In 1943, there was a huge exhibition. The biggest exhibition of Klimt ever done was presented in Austria under the auspices of the Austrian Nazi government. Adele Bloch Bauer portrait was just labeled "The Lady in Gold." And of course, because of the thefts and the appropriations of so many paintings, they had on hand, in fact, almost the entire oeuvre of Klimt's work.
What happened to the paintings during the war, I cannot tell you. I, at the time, lived here in Hollywood in a little house and had 2 very young children. I was only interested in raising a family. The last thing on my mind was property and jewelry and paintings. When we came to America, we lived on $35 a week. That's what Fritz made. We paid $5 for our apartment a week, and I paid $15 for groceries a week. My oldest son cost $50. That's what the doctor charged for the delivery. You can't buy a dog for that anymore.
After the war, the Allies sent back any looted art they found to the country of origin to be returned to its rightful owners.
The American authorities gave the Austrians a free ride on this. It was during the Cold War, and the Americans wanted Austria on the side of the Western Allies. And so the Americans did not really scrutinize the Austrians and their role both during the Third Reich and even in the post-war period. There was a myth that emerged that Austrians were the first victims of Nazi aggression. The reality is very different. Austrians comprised 8% of the population in the Reich, yet they were 14% of the SS, and they were 40% of the concentration and death camp guard staff.
In October 1945, Ferdinand Bloch Bauer wrote a new will.
He states very clearly that his property, including his art collection, is not to go to the Austrian gallery, and he does not act upon Adelia's request to give the Klimt paintings after his death. All his property is to go to his 3 nieces and nephews.
A month later, in November 1945, Ferdinand died. His ashes were placed next to his wife in the family vault in Vienna. After the war, Austria used its export permit law to acquire for free the most valuable paintings previously stolen by the Nazis.
In 1948, our then lawyer, Gustav Klimt, who was a very good friend of the family, approached the authorities and told them that the family's financial circumstances had totally changed from what they were before, and that we need the paintings in order to make money and sell them, and we wanted them back. She said, yes, there's one way in which we will give you this, and that is if you leave the Klimts here and if you donate them to us. In that case, we will make an exception and let you take the others out. And that's exactly what happened.
The Austrians retained the Klimts that had been stolen by the Nazis in 1938, only returning lesser valued paintings and porcelain to the Bloch Bauer heirs. The money raised helped Maria and Fritz bring up their 4 children in the United States. Others were not so lucky.
The degree of rip-off that these people experienced, the claimants, after the war, obviously always thinking that the war is over, the Nazis are gone, you know, now we can go back and recover what is rightfully ours.
In the 1950s and 1960s, there were, of course, restitution laws, also in Austria. But for the claimants, so the victims themselves or their heirs, it was hard to claim.
Going into the 70s, most significant documents pertaining to art looting in Austria were destroyed, were deliberately destroyed. And therefore, we just don't know how much was taken. We just don't know how much disappeared.
In 1984, the editor of America's Art News began to hear disquieting rumors about a hoard of stolen paintings hidden near Vienna. On arriving in Austria, Milton Esterau asked for permission to visit the 14th century Mauerbach monastery.
The first thing he said to me is, "Why are you here?" I reminded him very graciously that I had called him from New York and that I with this art magazine, and I'd like to find out more about the monastery. And I told him, I said, "When can I visit the monastery?" And he pounded his fist on the desk and he said, "You cannot go." I said to him, when I was a young reporter at the New York Times, a wise old editor told me that when somebody answers a question the way you have answered my question, that I should become suspicious that maybe you're hiding something. There were these thousands of works of art that the Nazis had stolen from Jews who eventually became victims of the Holocaust. And the works were just there. The Austrians were making absolutely no attempt to do anything about it. The story was published, and there was quite a commotion that developed as a result of that story. The Austrian Chancellor went on Austrian TV and said, but we plan to do something, but they didn't do anything.
Yielding to international pressure, the Austrian government circulated limited details of the art at Mauerbach.
Some of the people who did get would write back to the minister and saying, "Dear sir, these 2 paintings on the list, they hung in my parents' study back in Vienna before they were shipped off to Auschwitz, sir." And they described the paintings. In fact, they described the size of the paintings, 24 by 27. They said even what was on the back of these 2 paintings. This is an actual case that we wrote about, a woman who lived in New Jersey. She had everything. She described it perfectly, knew where the signature of the artists were. But they rejected the claim, the Austrians. Why? Because she had written that these paintings were 24 by 27. The paintings were actually 25 by 29. Now, how could she possibly remember the size, the exact size, 50 years after the fact? So this is the sort of thing that the Austrians were doing.
12 years after the revelations in Art News, Austria took action.
In 1996, there is an auction that is held by Christie's, and the collection that had been housed in Mauerbach is sold and raises over $14 million that goes primarily to the Jewish community in Vienna, in Austria. 4214. The Mauerbach repository shows how the Austrians did not engage their Nazi past and did not work on restitution issues for decades and decades.
In New York, 2 years later, the art world was shaken by an international scandal. 2 Egon Schiele paintings, Portrait of Wally and Dead City were loaned to New York's Museum of Modern Art by the Leopold Gallery of Vienna.
The two Schiele paintings were seized by the New York District Attorney, Robert Morgenthau, saying that these Schieles were Nazi looted art.
Within months of the seizure of the paintings, Austria's Minister of Culture, Elisabeth Gera, presented a new art restitution law to the Austrian Parliament. The new law required Austria to return any paintings that had been forcibly donated in return for export permits. Austria began to open its archives. One of the first Austrians to investigate the story behind the paintings was the campaigning journalist Hubertus Czernin.
The work at this time was very, very difficult, as we were not allowed to make copies of the documents. We had to write all documents by hand. Usually as a historian or a journalist, you're used to work with copy of documents, seeing signatures, dates and stuff like that. And actually it took 1 year until I got the whole Bloch Bauer file.
Without Czernin, we wouldn't have anything. Czernin helped us to get all the documents from the Belvedere, all the information.
Armed with this new information, Maria Altmann could now challenge the Austrian claims to ownership of the Klimt paintings. She needed a lawyer. She turned to an old family friend, Randolph Schoenberg, the grandson of another Viennese refugee, the composer Arnold Schoenberg.
Maria is a very close friend of my family. She was very close with my grandmother, and matter of fact, her husband Fritz and my mother's father were close friends in the 30s back in Austria. So when both families fled and ended up in Los Angeles, they maintained the friendship. So when she asked me in 1998 to help her out with this issue, of course I said yes.
Randolph Schoenberg agreed to pursue the case on a no-win, no-fee basis.
If you had asked Maria Altmann before 1998 what had happened with the Klimt paintings, she would have told you exactly the same lie that she was told, that her family was told after the war by the Austrian government, which was that the paintings had been given by Adele Bloch Bauer in 1925.
The provenance of the paintings has long been the subject of conflicting opinions.
Dr. Gerbert Frodel, who at this moment is the director of the Austrian Gallery, has been mistaken in his information about the provenance of these paintings. For example, Frodel maintained that the Golden Adele came into the possession of the Austrian Gallery in 1936. Again, a completely specious date that has no bearing to reality, and that Adele Bloch Bauer II, another painting that's in dispute, came into possession of the gallery in 1928. And again, this is a fantasy date. In 1928, Adele Bloch Bauer II was hanging in the memorial room in the Elisabethstrasse Palais.
In September 1998, Randolph Schoenberg, on behalf of Maria Altmann, submitted a claim for the return of the paintings. With her son Jim filming the trip, Maria flew to Vienna in 1999, hoping the Austrian authorities would accept that the Klimt paintings were stolen property. While in Vienna, Maria had a meeting with the director of Austria's National Gallery.
Director Frodel said, "Now that we are alone, let's see what is in each other's hearts." And I said, well, we are really not alone. I have a lawyer, and tell me what is in your heart. And he said, well, we have plenty of landscapes. Take the landscapes, but just don't take the portraits.
And what of the necklace featured in the portrait of Adele Bloch Bauer? It found its way into the collection of the wife of Field Marshal Hermann Goering, Hitler's right-hand man. The necklace from the golden portrait has never been seen again. As for the Klimts, the Minister for Culture, Elisabeth Gera, was determined they stay in Austria.
Hubertus Czernin took me for an interview with Minister Gera, and finally, after an hour, I said, Minister Gera, I'm sure you have other things to do, but before I go, I just want to mention one thing. When you were in New York, you said if you want to fight a last will, you have to go to court. Frau Minister, there was no last will. It was simply a request to her husband. And she said, oh, das weiß ich ja. I know that. And that was the only thing I discussed with her. And then I said goodbye, and that was it.
Austria was gripped with suspense in the run-up to Minister Gera's decision.
A couple of weeks before the definite decision, I got a phone call by a source telling me suddenly it becomes much more difficult. I asked why, and the answer was that there are main forces in the government who don't think that we can restitute those paintings. They are very important for the country.
On June the 28th, 1999, Minister Gera announced that Austria would not return the Klimts to the Bloch Bauer heirs.
They said, well, the will gave the paintings to the museum. That's not correct. It wasn't correct as a matter of law, and they didn't allow us to make any presentation or argument to the board, and they made up their mind sort of in a one-sided and unilateral way.
They never even tried to show the faintest gesture in showing we are willing to negotiate with you.
Back in Los Angeles, Maria Altmann and her attorney had to decide whether to fight on and how. Randolph Schoenberg decided to use a law that allows Americans to sue foreign governments from within the United States. For 3 years, Maria and Randall fought their way through the California court system. Astonishingly, they would win at every stage. As a last resort, Austria appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States.
When the case was before the United States Supreme Court, the United States government, and specifically the Bush administration, filed a brief on behalf of Austria. It's called an amicus brief. It's a friend of the court brief. And they could have filed a brief on behalf of Mrs. Altmann. They didn't. They filed a brief on behalf of Austria.
No, that's agreed. We never asked the Supreme Court to take our case. Never. We wouldn't have dared. We thought it would have no chance.
If you had asked just about any lawyer in the United States whether I had any chance of success, I think the conclusion would have been no way. It was an incredible long shot, and so I had a little bit of a gallows humor, I think, going into it.
The Third Reich has been gone since 1945, but the crimes of the Nazis are still reverberating. For Maria Altmann, surviving the Nazis was not enough. Bruce Morton reports.
Altmann is suing under a U.S. law passed in 1976. Does it apply retroactively to events in the 1940s? Austria and the United States argue no.
We got to the day of the argument in February of 2004, and when I finally got up to speak, it was after the Austrian government's lawyer and the U.S. government's lawyer. And I got about 2 lines into it, and Justice Souter, one of the Supreme Court justices, interrupted me and asked me this question. And I looked at him, and I had not the slightest idea what he had just asked me, not a clue how to answer. I said, I'm sorry, Your Honor, I didn't understand the question. Could you please rephrase it? And it was such an honest moment. I think it worked actually to my advantage in the long run, because they looked at me as if to say, oh, don't worry about it. We didn't understand the question either.
This case is related to Austria. I think there's no reason that this case should be seen in a foreign court, and the only reference point to the United States is that Maria Altmann is living there. This is the only reference point, no other.
After her day in court, Maria had to wait 3.5 months for the Supreme Court decision.
And the incredible thing is that we won, and we won great. We didn't win just like that, we won the 6-3.
The case still had to go to trial and be decided on its merits. Austria had the option of continuing with the litigation.
We agreed to have an Austrian mediator come. He said, listen, you can either battle for years and years more, or perhaps we can come up with a procedure for resolving it faster. And the idea of arbitration came up, and so we agreed to that procedure.
The arbitration panel comprised 3 Austrian lawyers sitting in Austria and applying Austrian law.
All the 3 of them have experience in arbitration, so I'm quite confident that they will make a reasonable decision.
The issue is, how did the Austrian government get possession and control of these paintings? Was it through the will of Adele Bloch Bauer, or was it for export permits in 1948?
The arbitration panel announced its decision to the press on January the 17th, 2006.
The arbitration award was basically a confirmation of our position all along, which was that Adele's will was a non-issue. It was non-binding and never had been, and therefore that these paintings were effectively given to the museum after the war in exchange for export permits, and as a result have to be returned.
Did you meet Klimt? Did you have any kind of...
No.
So you never met the legendary...
I'm old, but not that old.
How did you feel for you personally? Vindication? How would you say?
No vindication. I just felt great and happy.
Were you surprised, or did you have a feeling it was going in this direction?
I must say that I had a feeling it was going in this direction. My kids kept saying, you shouldn't be so positive, but I was. See, Randy, they'd say, how come I was so positive that you would win?
I don't know. I was not as positive as you were. I was.
Success.
Das Schiedsgericht hat gestern entschieden, dass diese 5 Klimt-Gemälde der Familie Altmann und ihren Erben gehören, und wir werden diese 5 Gemälde restituieren.
But there was one last chance for Austria to keep the paintings. A condition of the arbitration was that Austria had the right of first refusal to buy the paintings at the market price. The 5 paintings were valued at $300 million by Austrian and American advisors.
These paintings are really part of Austrian cultural heritage. They are very, very important for the time frame of the Finicerkel.
Ich glaube, dass es hier sehr intensive Bemühungen geben muss, dieses und vielleicht auch andere dieser 5 Gemälde für Österreich zu erhalten.
Dame in Gold. Wer kauft nach der Rückgabe? Zu Gast im Studio Hans Winkler.
The paintings, their history and future, provoked unprecedented public discussion in Austria about art, its meaning and value.
The idea to have to give them away collides with the Austrian identity, with the idea of Austrian identity.
Decades of post-war amnesia have clouded Austria's identity and responsibilities. But things are slowly changing. This monument, nameless, by the British artist Rachel Whiteread, is a memorial to the 65,000 Austrian Jews who died in the Holocaust. Since 1995, 30,000 Austrian Holocaust survivors have been given a symbolic payment of $6,000, and Austria has returned more than 4,000 cultural items stolen by the Nazis. Today, Austria has $210 million in a general settlement fund, but it's distributing in modest amounts to more than 200,000 outstanding Holocaust compensation claims.
Every time when we ask a survivor to fill in a form where we even only ask him for his address in 1938, we do re-traumatize this person. All the memories that they have been trying to get rid of come back through our restitution schemes. You cannot bring their youth back, you cannot bring their health back. So what can be done is money. But it's very little you can do. As my father said, I mean, his mother was killed in Auschwitz. If I give him $50 million, it won't bring back his mother.
The Austrian government may have set aside $210 million to meet its outstanding Holocaust-related claims. But an additional $300 million were needed for Austria to acquire the 5 Klimt paintings.
Dass die Republik Österreich nicht mehr weiter verhandelt, weil wir es nicht für möglich halten, dass wir aus dem Budget $300 Millionen aufbringen können.
Unwilling to pay the market price for the stolen paintings, and having held on to them for over half a century, Austria was now forced to send them to Maria Altmann in California.
5 paintings by the Austrian master Gustav Klimt, once stolen by the Nazis, go on display tomorrow in Los Angeles. It's the first time that they've been seen in this country. One of them, the golden portrait of a woman, is among the world's most famous paintings.
And a question for you, Mr. Chernin. What is your reaction to the fact that Austrian government seemingly was not interested or able to raise $300 million?
They had opinion polls stating that 2/3 of the Austrians are against it. And so it was a beautiful story for them to tell, we would like to buy, but the offer of the heirs is so high that we can't afford it.
I have been told that your plans for the painting after this exhibit is they're going to be put on sale at Christie's.
There have been absolutely no decisions with regard to what will happen to the paintings next. The issue was and always has been that these paintings belonged to this family up until the time the Nazis came in and took them off the walls. And now, in the year 2006, they're finally returned to that family.
All I want is the paintings are accessible to the public. I wouldn't like them in private homes.
The 3 landscapes and the second portrait of Adele Bloch Bauer went on sale at Christie's in New York on the 8th of November 2006.
It's our privilege to have you here on what for us is a very special evening. And it's my real privilege to introduce to you a very special lady, and I choose my terms carefully, Maria Altmann, who is the niece of the late Ferdinand and Adele Bloch Bauer.
You wanted them to remain in public collection.
Exactly.
Why are you selling it to perhaps a private collector?
I'm not the only one. I have 4 co-heirs, and we would very much like to see the paintings for the rest of the time in public view. So our hope will be that there will be museums that will acquire them.
Lot 51, the Klimt birch trees, $28 million, $33 million. At $36 million, all done and selling right at $36 million. The second Klimt, The Attersee landscape there, lot 52. In this case, $10 million starts it. All done at $28 million. For you, madam. Third Klimt, apple tree number 1, showing on the screen again, far right, 1912, at $24,500,000. Selling this side for $29,500,000. The fourth Klimt there, portrait of Adele Bloch Bauer 2, showing again on the screen, far right, and as illustrated in your catalogues, the 1912 portrait, $57,500,000. 65 million at $78,500,000 on this telephone. Fair warning. Guy, your bidder at $78 million, $500,000.
Can you tell us whether the Klimts went to individuals or institutions?
I think it's probably fair to say they were all anonymously bought, but my assumption is they went to individuals.
But what happened to the golden portrait of Adele Bloch Bauer?
Now you're looking at the most expensive painting ever sold. Already hailed by its new owner as our Mona Lisa, the cosmetic tycoon Ronald Lauder has just paid a record £73 million for Klimt's glittering cold portrait for his Neue Gallery in Manhattan.
A 90-year-old Jewish woman took on the state of Austria and won.
I feel incredibly fortunate to see a just solution while so many people didn't live to see any solution.
More than half a century late, Maria and her family have finally received some kind of justice and restitution. Meanwhile, the golden portrait goes on public display in New York for the foreseeable future. And as this historic decision reverberates throughout the world, many more victims are now coming forward to stake their claims.